Super. Charles, thanks so much. Great to be here. To everyone who's online, thanks for joining today. Everyone in the room, thanks for joining today. So Africa. It's a relatively small market for rendered products. My colleague today was talking to some of the manufacturers of rendering equipment who indicated, good luck with Africa. It's going to take a long time. And they're right. This is a market that's going to take some time. It doesn't inspire a lot of immediate seller interest, and we recognize that. But that's the status quo today. That's not the future. I won't today deliver my speech on why Africa is the future of food consumption, but it is the only contiguous geography on the planet that has a growing population, a growing GDP, and rapidly increasing urbanization, all of which favor animal feed production, livestock production, poultry production, aquaculture production, and consumption. So the North American Renders Association has been promoting the development of these markets in North Africa since about 2021. We have helped in Morocco, and we'll speak about that in a minute, to have a pet food window opened for the inclusion of rendered products into the pet food manufacturing industry in Morocco. There is, however, a lot of legwork to be covered in these markets. While BSE in the markets that are developed is something that is well understood, well regulated, and the industry has incorporated those important lessons to ensure that the feedstock coming out of the rendering operations is safe and able to be used, and the industry knows how to safely incorporate rendered products into feedstocks for a healthy and safe ration. These lessons across the vast majority of Africa have yet to be learned. And we really see that as part of our job, is to help enhance understanding, increase education, and engage broadly with stakeholders engaged in the animal feed industry in these markets. So the things we're trying to do right now with the North American Renders Association, we're trying to build positive stakeholder environment. We're trying to create market access. We're doing a lot of really industry and business-led engagement. So speaking directly to the industrial actors, whether it's the feed millers, whether it's the federations that deal with livestock, aquaculture, or poultry. Those are the doors we're knocking on right now. Regulators, those come a little later, and that's the advocacy that we see after we've talked to industry to get really the industry on board first and then go and talk to the regulators. So some of the markets we're looking at right now to get us started are in green. We have Morocco, Tunisia, Senegal, so majority Muslim countries. We have Ivory Coast and Ghana with more of a mixed religious culture. And that, of course, has some different impacts depending on the both ethnic as well as religious characteristics of the population, what the requirements may be for rendered product inclusion. South Africa, which is an existing importer of rendered products, actually quite substantial and the largest on the continent. And Kenya, which is a market that we're going to be examining, or North American Renders Association is going to be examining this year. What we're seeing very consistently is that the industry support is there. Once we start talking about how to use rendered products to enhance an animal feed ration, you could see the wheels start to turn. The lights kind of go on saying, this is something we've heard about. We don't really know how to do, but it sounds pretty good. And I'll give you an example in a few minutes. But when we talk to the regulators see one thing: risk. And it is a risk they do not understand. It is not a risk they master, nor is it a risk they know how to mitigate in the context of their country's food ecosystem. And so their immediate reaction is, no, rendered product inclusion, we will not right now authorize based on where we are in our industry. And we see that really consistently. And this is directly linked to the BSE. And we're talking something that is now managed in most of our markets 15, 20 years now. But that mentality and that framework is a bit frozen in time. And we see one of our primary objectives in a lot of these markets is to bring up to date an understanding about how to manage and mitigate these risks, how to safely use these products for feed inclusion. We'll start with Morocco. So Morocco is a country where we've spent a lot of time. The industry has been pushing now for several years to open the window for rendered product inclusion. We were able to get on board with NARA and the industry to promote the use of rendered products in animal feed inclusion. And after about 2 years of work and working closely with the industry, we had our first major success. A window was opened for pet food inclusion for rendered products last March. And I'll explain that on the next slide, why that came about. After a lot of work and engagement with the local industry, we were able to successfully hold a workshop in 2024 in June. And in that workshop, we were able to bring in some parties from Tunisia. We were able to bring in some parties from Senegal who are quite interested in developing rendering capabilities or using rendered products for inclusion in their feed ration. In the context of that meeting, we were able to, together with Dana, who led the meeting, sit with the local industry, sit with the regulators, and go line by line the regulatory framework for using rendered products in animal feed compositions. And we were able to, in a very collaborative approach, come up with some language that would make the regulatory environment favorable to a wide range of exporting countries who manufacture rendered products to allow Morocco to have a choice of countries to import rendered products from. That legislation still navigating its way through the local legislature, but we're hopeful that that legislation is going to pass and create a window for beyond pet food, bringing rendered products into the Moroccan market for the feed industry inclusion. We also are hoping to do some reverse trade missions. We've got some engagement. We hope to get some industry regulators from Morocco over to the United States, hope to show them some rendering operations, demonstrate its safety, demonstrate the efficacy, also bring over some feed millers, talk about how to do formulation for feed rations to create really a favorable environment within the Moroccan industry to allow for rendered product inclusion. Pet food. You can see, going back about 10, 15 years, pet food growth and sales in Morocco was pretty stable, growing slightly until COVID. With COVID, people stuck at home, you can see very clearly just the hockey stick of imports, increasing imports of pet food. For everyone who owns a feed mill or who owns a harvest facility in Morocco, this was an opportunity for them, immediately clear, hey, can we do pet food locally, do some import substitution, manufacture pet food locally, and create a local industry for pet food in Morocco. And that's exactly what's happening. And so when we're engaging and talking about how to use rendered products in animal feeds, we're also talking about pet food. And this was one of the ways we were able to sort of dialogue with local industry and also to a certain extent with the regulators and say, hey, if you're trying to develop a pet food industry, you're going to need rendered products that you aren't manufacturing and able to develop in your home market. This is where we come in to provide support. And it was via that dialogue and also via some training and some technical assistance, we were able to convince the regulators and help the Moroccan industry come to agreement to open a window for rendered product inclusion in pet food. And we really hope that this is going to be a template for how we continue to work in Africa and how NARA continues to work in Africa to open markets for rendered product inclusion. Notwithstanding, it's a very small market. So there's about 2,000 tons of tallow that come into the market. We think that's primarily for the soap industry. But sorry, I don't know how to go. Hey, Charles, how do you go back? Got it. Never mind. So this is a market where there's very, very little trade, but we do hope to open the market and create a favorable trading environment. Tunisia. We completed a market study in Tunisia last year. We've been engaging with the limited number of actors that are feed millers in Tunisia. There are existing rendering operations in Tunisia, and that rendered product is making its way into a local pet food manufacturing industry. Tunisia is a country, it's quite small. In order for Tunisia's economy to grow, Tunisia really has to develop export opportunity, and they found trading relationships with some of their Arab partners, exports to Turkey, to the Middle East, Egypt to a lesser extent. And the engagement we're following with them is, hey, you have a rendering industry, albeit quite small. You have a pet food industry. If you want to grow this, you're going to potentially need to bring in more rendered product in order to grow that industry. On paper, it is possible to bring rendered products into Tunisia. In practice, very little to effectively zero rendered product makes its way into Tunisia, partially because the industry that can use those rendered products still remains quite small. There is also a quite large aquaculture sector right now, which is not using rendered product for feed formulation for aquaculture. So the approach that we'll be launching over the course of the spring, go back to Tunisia, spend more time engaging with the aquaculture sector, spend some more time engaging with the pet food manufacturers, and talking about how do we use what is an open regulatory framework for importing rendered products. How do we use that open framework to actually bring product in and to use those rendered products to help increase your productivity in your aquaculture sector, as well as create some opportunities in your pet food sector. As already mentioned, you can look at the numbers, effectively zero trading volume, but we do think that this is a market that over time will be an interesting market for rendered products. Senegal is a kind of an interesting case. So Senegal, also similar to Morocco, total feed ban inclusion up until the window was open for pet food inclusion in Morocco. Right now, Senegal, total feed ban inclusion. There are a couple buts in there. First, Senegal is identified by the US government as a strategic partner in West Africa. It is a peaceful and democratic country in a really, really tough neighborhood, surrounded by Mali, Burkina, Niger. Senegal successfully went through what was initially a rocky election process, which was a bit of a shame because it's been almost 25 years of quite consistent, peaceful, democratic transition in power. But despite that rocky election start, ended up having a quite democratic and successful and quite peaceful democratic transition to a new president. The new president and his administration is extremely open to developing local industry, very, very growth oriented, very open to working with international partners to enhance competitiveness. What we see, though, is Senegal is a country that did not have much knowledge at all about rendered product. When we had our first set of meetings with feed millers in Senegal, the general sense was, yeah, we know that there's this animal protein stuff that you can use in feed, but we don't really know how to use it. We know some other people do it. And that was sort of the extent of the knowledge. Well, we were able to work closely with one of the commercialization directors of a feed mill owned by Seaboard called Grand Moulin de Dakar. We were able to get them to our training in June last year. That same individual came to an agricultural trade mission funded by US Department of Agriculture in December. And so that individual is at a reception. We're with Dana, a couple people from our team, and we have at that reception the head of the Poultry Federation. We have the chief veterinary officer of the Poultry Federation. We have a rep from the aquaculture sector. And so we're giving them the dialogue and the sell about rendered products. And so one of them looked at me and said, so spend a little bit of time telling me about rendered products and how you use these products in our feed formulation. I said, well, let me turn to Balde, who was here at our workshop in June, and see if he did his homework. And sure enough, he spent about 10 minutes, like he had clearly read the 100 pages of presentations that were sent post workshop, and really spent the time explaining to his colleagues about how you do inclusion of rendered products in feed formulation. And you could really see these eyes light up again and get kind of excited, like this is something we need to learn about. And lo and behold, that almost the same group was here yesterday as part of a trade delegation. We had come to the NARA booth. We had the president of the poultry industry in Senegal. We had the head of the largest feed mill in Senegal, and the head of the second largest feed mill in Senegal, and the head nutritionist of the second largest feed mill in Senegal. And so we're talking and talking, and the nutritionist is worried about risk. And you could just see the skepticism in her eye about, so I want to talk to someone about feed formulation. So we were able to call up Charles, who came over, and Charles spent, it was just this delightful conversation as Charles was talking to her about how to consider formulation for poultry sector, how to consider formulation for the aquaculture sector safely, but also to increase animal productivity and animal health. And you could see the nutritionist as the sort of the lights came on and she sort of assembled a framework of understanding about how to use these products in complement to some of the other products they're using right now to create an animal feed ration. And then at the end of this about 10-minute exchange, the director of the largest feed mill in Senegal turned to me and said, Nara, you need to become evangelical about using rendered products. This makes a lot of sense. And Senegal is a country where there's a pretty close relationship between the regulators and the industry, because it's a small market in a tough neighborhood. And they know there needs to be a certain suppleness in order to enhance competitiveness and economic growth. And it's using that sort of close relationship and flexible and dynamic relationship that we think we're going to be able to create some market opportunity for inclusion of rendered products in feed mills in Senegal in the pretty near future. The industry seems to be totally on board. And next step is really to work with the regulators. Again, looking at the numbers, basically no trade at all in rendered product. Ivory Coast. Ivory Coast on paper is an open market. We have met with the feed mills, we've met with the agricultural chamber, and we've met with the regulators. According to the regulations, it is possible today to import the entire range of rendered products into the Ivory Coast. However, that trading volume is exactly zero in almost every category. We know that there have been feed mills in the Ivory Coast that have used meat and bone meal. We know that there was an application for importing feather meal into the Ivory Coast about 2023 that was not approved. So we sat down with the regulator, and it was one of the most open and transparent dialogues I've certainly had with the regulator, where the regulator said, look, we know that our industry wants this. We know that this is an input that is effectively regulated in other markets. We know this is an input that has some real value for animal health. However, we as the regulator do not know how to regulate this. We do not know how to manage the risk, and we don't have confidence that neither does our industry. So I said, are you open to getting some technical assistance? Are you open to having some training in order to create an environment where you can effectively regulate this industry using rendered product as a feed input? His answer is absolutely. Our job as a regulator is to regulate safely our industry, but it is also a job to allow the industry to work efficiently and effectively. And I found that to be a very, very healthy dialogue and a very open dialogue. It is a market. It's a quite dynamic country. If you have the opportunity to go to Côte d'Ivoire, very, very dynamic African country. A little bit off the radar of the United States because it's Francophone, but it's one of my favorite places to visit. We're really looking forward to getting back there early this spring and having a more, let's say, a deeper dialogue with local industry and the feed mills. The feed millers are quite substantial and quite professional in the Ivory Coast. They do trade from the Ivory Coast into neighboring markets. There's quite a lot of cross-border trade. And so we think that if we can open up the Ivorian market for inclusion into animal feeds, that is also by extension going to allow some re-exporting, or if you will, transshipping of products into other markets by virtue of feed inclusion. So we think there's some real potential here, particularly because they've already gone through the legislative legwork of regulating on paper the market, but it is really going from having an on-paper regulation to getting the individual shipment approvals that are needed in order to actually get a shipment into the country. We have an in-country representative right now that's beginning the outreach with the sector, and we're looking to, hopefully, the next time we talk, bringing you some updates. Again, effectively, no trading volume, although there has historically been some trading volume in meat and bone meal. Kenya is a target for the NARA leadership as a market to explore and to update. It is a country that has a quite substantial livestock sector, although pastoral livestock, has a growing poultry sector. It's Anglophone, tends to be a target for American exporters because it's Anglophone. There is some limited rendering in country, and there's a collaboration already that exists between the Brazilian Renderers Association and local industry. There are some imports. There is the ability to import rendered products into Kenya with additional sanitary certificates and some compliance that needs to be accomplished, but it's possible. So this is a market that's really going to be an explore market for NARA coming up. And we think that there's some opportunity here. You can see there's very limited trading volume, but there is some trading volume of these products. As we progress through the slide deck, you'll start to see there's actually some of these markets do have trading volumes. We're getting to Ghana and then South Africa, where there is actually existing trade. So Ghana, meat and bone meal in 2023, somewhere between $1 million to $1.5 million in trade. It's a country that has active renderers. So there are some companies doing rendering, although quite small, but they're actively rendering. Has a livestock industry, it has a poultry industry looking for rendered products. But the aquaculture sector, and it was great to see the presentations earlier today focused on aquaculture because Ghana has a pretty interesting aquaculture sector. It's one of the more productive aquaculture sectors in sub-Saharan Africa. And with fish meal prices being so expensive, using alternative sources of animal protein for aquaculture ration completion, quite interesting. So this is a market. There is the ability to use rendered products for feed inclusion. It's very, very price sensitive, but culturally and religiously, it's quite mixed as a country. So there's not the halal issue that you have in some of the majority Muslim countries in Africa. We were very delighted this week to host a dinner, a number of representatives from the feed mills as well as from the poultry industry in Ghana, creating some of those basic relationships that are going to be important to develop this market for NARA membership. You can see here, there is some trading volume right now, but you will note that for Americans, effectively zero, at least in 2023. The last market of interest is South Africa. This is a market that is actually quite well developed. There is an active rendering industry in South Africa. There is a growing pet food industry in South Africa. There is the ability to import rendered products into South Africa, and the trading volumes are actually pretty interesting. When you look at the totality of all the traded volume of rendered products, you're well into sort of the 40+ million US dollar range. And the South African market services some of its neighboring countries across the border. NARA has identified the South African market for a more detailed market assessment later this year. The results are going to help inform this approach in South Africa, but already there's some, at least we have some consultants on the ground that are working on the industry and who have some experience in the sector. We do think that as this pet food industry continues to grow, that there's going to be a requirement for bringing additional rendered product in. I'll just show you the numbers on the next slide. Get a sense of what the numbers look like. As that pet food industry continues to grow, there's going to be a requirement for increasing that volume of imported rendered product. And that's really going to be an area, certainly for the American exporters. Once again, you look at the very bottom, the American exporters have effectively zero play right now in South Africa. And that's something we certainly want to try to change and influence and talk about why bringing in product from the United States is a really interesting source of supply for a variety of both technical and nutrition content reasons. Well, this is the last slide. to get a sense of where we are within the regulatory context, Africa has not been a priority focus area for APHIS for rendered products. Certainly, APHIS spends most of their time on the feed industry, dealing with soy, grain, corn as feed industry inputs. What we hope to do with our persistent engagement now with the North American Renders Association is in Africa, start to bring rendered product higher onto the agenda and get it really onto the radar of the FAS officers who are negotiating those bilateral agreements, who are negotiating the trade regulations, who are helping facilitate APHIS sanitary certificate negotiations, and making sure that rendered product becomes a priority for market development so that we can help bring improved animal nutrition to a variety of different sectors in the markets that we're looking to serve in Africa. South Africa, there's not an APHIS certificate in place, but there is a documentation mechanism that does exist to bring rendered product in. We need some help from FAS to really elaborate that, because right now there's not something that's standardized. Tunisia, we can bring in hides, can't bring in animal feed inputs. And then for Morocco, Senegal, Ivory Coast, Ghana, and Kenya, there's really a whole range of different certification requirements or documentation requirements. And that's certainly one of the areas where we're going to work, is try to facilitate that and simplify some of these requirements to bring product into the country. So thank you very much. Very happy to take questions. And we're hoping over the years to bring you some exciting highlights in Africa as we start to open these markets up.